Hello, Daddy.
When I think of jazz, who's the first person that comes to mind? Probably this guy, Louis Armstrong. The man whose smile became almost as legendary as his music. Now some of you might be thinking, wait, what about Frank Sinatra? Well, here's the thing. Sinatra was an incredible performer, but he was mainly a traditional pop singer. When we talk about jazz itself, names like Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker and Charles Mingus are much closer to the heart of the genre. I live here in Paris and music has always been a huge part of my life. So, here a question. What kind of music represents Paris? Pop, classical, rock, blues or jazz? Most people will probably say classic music, but jazz has a much deeper connection to Paris than many people realize. In fact, Paris has one of the most fascinating jazz stories in the world, and today we're going to discover it together. I am Daniel. If you enjoy video about Paris, stories, history most tourists never hear, don't forget to put like on this video. Subscribe and write what you think in the comment. Believe it or not, the story of Parisian jazz isn't really about music. It's about freedom, migration, art, and people searching for a place when they could truly belong. If New York is where jazz was born, Paris became the city where jazz truly grew up. It was here that people stopped seeing jazz as exotic American entertainment and started treating it as real art. Long before jazz ever arrived, Paris was already the creative capital of Europe. Artists, writers, musicians, everyone wanted to be here. Picasso, Modigliani, Hemingway. Neighborhoods like Montmartre and later Saint-Germain-des-Prés became playgrounds for creativity. New artistic movements were born almost every year, but there was still one thing Europe had ever experienced before: jazz. Then came 1917 and everything changed during World War I. Thousands of American soldiers arrived in France, but they didn't come alone, they brought something with them. Music, one band, led by James Reese Europe, will completely change the way France hears sound. There was something very special about this orchestra. It was made up entirely of African American musicians for French audiences. This way, unlike anything they had ever seen or heard, for the very first time people heard syncopated rhythms, blues harmonies, true improvisation and entirely new way of playing brass instruments. Technically the band played something closer to ragtime and military marches mixed with early jazz, but none of that really mattered, because for France this was beginning of an entirely new music language, and from that moment on, jazz will never leave Paris again. So why did Paris become the second home of jazz? There wasn't just one reason, they were several, and together they created the perfect place for jazz to grow. Back in the early 900s, life wasn't easy for black musicians in the United States. Segregation affected almost every part of daily life. Many incredible talented artists weren't judged by their music, they were judged by the color of their skin. France wasn't a perfect country either, but for many American musicians, Paris felt like freedom. For the first time, they could perform in famous clubs, meet painters, writers and filmmakers, earn a good living, and most importantly, they could simply be treated like artists, not just black musicians. Well, that's one of the biggest reasons so many jazz legends decided to stay in Paris. Another reason, Paris absolutely loved artistic revolution. People here were already using to seeing the impossible become normal. The Impressionists completely changed painting. Cubism broke every traditional rule of perspective. Writers experimented with language, poets changed old ideas. So when jazz arrived, people didn't see it as just dance music. They saw it as the next great artistic revolution. After World War I came one of the most exciting periods in Parisian history. The French call it Les Années Folles, the crazy 20s. The city came alive, nightlife exploded, hundreds of clubs opened their doors, Among the most famous were Le Boeuf sur le Toit, Brick Stop, Bal, Neger. If you wanted to experience jazz, this was for the first time. Jazz wasn't just something people listened to, it became fashionable. They became part of Paris itself. It changed it. Here something a lot of people don't realize. Parisian jazz isn't really separate genre. It's more like a different way of thinking about music. If you compare it with New York or Chicago, the difference go far beyond the notes. But emotion, American jazz grew directly out of the blues. Listen to Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker or Thelonious Monk. Their music is full of tension, energy, movement, the sound of the city that never stops. French musicians took a different path they loved. Beautiful melodies, soft textures, long harmonies and improvisation that felt almost like storytelling. Parisian jazz isn't try to overwhelm you. It invites you in. French musicians didn't grow up listening only to jazz. They were also surrounded by composers like Claude Debussy, Maurice Ravel and Gabriel Fauré. That influence never disappeared. It's one of the reasons French jazz sounds so unique. You'll often hear unexpected chords, rich harmonies, beautiful colors and music that feels incredibly spacious. Later, this style would influence jazz all across Europe. And this may be France's greatest contribution to jazz, Django Reinhardt. Instead of building his music around big brass sections like American swing bands, he created something completely different. Acoustic guitars, a violin instead for a saxophone, almost no drums, and guitar solos that still sound unbelievable today. The result became known as Gypsy Jazz or Jazz Manouche, a style that could only have been born in France. There is another fascinating difference. In New York, especially during the bebop era, improvisation often felt like a competition. Musicians pushed each other to play faster, more creatively, more technically. Paris had a different philosophy. Improvisation wasn't about proving who was the best, it was about serving the music, creating atmosphere, telling a story, keeping the beauty of the moment alive. 4 personalities. Think of jazz cities as people. New Orleans is joyful, colorful, always ready for a street parade. Chicago is energetic, powerful, full of rhythm. New York is ambitious, fast, always trying to invent something new. And Paris? Paris is a dreamer, elegant, poetic, a city that cares just as much about emotion as technique. That's why many American musicians later said something remarkable. In Paris, they finally felt like artists, not entertainers. Artists. And maybe that's what made Paris truly special. In America, jazz was part of the music industry. In Paris, it quickly became part of something much bigger. Philosophers talked about it, writers write about it, painters found inspiration in it. Jazz entered the same conversation as literature, painting and theater. It became music that made people think, not just dance. In the end, Paris didn't invent jazz. America did. But Paris gave jazz something just as important, a second home. It became the place where jazz stopped belonging on the country and became a language the whole world could speak. That's why even today European jazz often sounds more cinematic, more melodic and more atmospheric. But it still keeps the one thing that has always defined the jazz: freedom tag improvisation. Josephine Baker, the woman who changed everything in 1925. A young American performer arrived in Paris. Her name was Josephine Baker. No one expected what would happen next. She became one of the biggest stars France had ever seen. To the French people, Josephine represented something completely new: freedom, confidence, energy, modernity. She wasn't just entertaining audiences. She became the face of an entire generation, but her story didn't end on stage during World War II. Josephine secretly worked later. France awarded her some of its highest national honors. She wasn't only a music icon, she became a national hero. Ask many French people which American jazz musicians truly belong to Paris, and they'll probably answer Sidney Bechet. He first came to France in 1920s, and after World War II, he made a life-changing decision. He stayed forever. Why? His answer became legendary. In France, people listened to me as an artist, not as a black musician. That one sentence explains everything. Bechet became a superstar. His records sold across the country, streets were named after him, and when he passed away, thousands of people filled the streets of Paris to say goodbye. Very few foreign musicians have ever received that kind of love. But history wasn't always kind to jazz. When Nazi Germany occupied France, everything changed again. The Nazi regime considers jazz to be that they call it generate music. Some performances were banned, some musicians were forced into silence, but jazz refused to disappear. Many artists continued to play it in secret, hidden clubs stayed alive, private concerts continued, and here's one of history's strange little contradictions. Some German officers secretly loved jazz themselves, even when the regime officially rejected it. When the war finally ended in 1945, Paris came back to life, American music returned once again. Some came for concerts, others never left. For many of them, Paris wasn't simply another stop on tour. It had become home. Paris inspired the rest of the country. Soon, jazz festivals began appearing all across France. One of the most famous is the Nice Jazz Festival. Founded in 1948, it's still one of the oldest jazz festivals anywhere in the world. By then, jazz was no longer just an American sound. It has become part of French culture itself. Paris today, more than 100 years later, Paris is still one of Europe's greatest jazz cities. Walk through the city at night and you still hear jazz pouring out of small clubs hidden between old streets. Places like Le Duc, Le Lombards, Sunset Sunside and New Morning continue to welcome some of the world's best musicians. Every year Paris hosts international festivals, intimate concerts, street performance and gypsy jazz events that keep this incredible tradition alive. This city never stopped listening, and maybe it never will. The biggest gift Paris gave to jazz wasn't a new instrument, it wasn't a new rhythm, it wasn't even a new genre, it was something much bigger. Paris proved that jazz didn't belong to just one country, a musical language born in the African-American communities of New Orleans, crossed an ocean and found a second home. Here, jazz became more than entertainment, it became freedom, curiosity, creativity and conversation between cultures. And that's exactly why people still call Paris the second capital of jazz. The story of Parisian jazz isn't really about France or America, it's about what happened when cultures meet. When people from different backgrounds inspire one another, when music travels further than politics, further than borders, and even further than language itself. That's what makes jazz so special. No matter where you're from, you can always understand it, because improvisation speaks a language everyone can feel. So, that's the incredible story of Parisian jazz, one of the city's most beautiful and often overlooked stories. Paris has inspired artists for centuries, painters, writers, filmmakers, musicians, and somehow it continues inspiring people today. Maybe that's why you're watching this video right now. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching, I am Daniel. If you like this little journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe and let me know in the comments. What's your favorite style of music? Or which city do you think has the strongest musical identity? I'd love to read your answer. And now